prosperity allows you just to ask different questions. And those different questions give you different things to focus on, which is really exciting, but also then opens up a whole world of things that you've never even thought about. There's never even been space for.
Mm-hmm. Welcome to Breaking Bread, the podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. It's excellent to have you along. Brian and Ted are here in the studio with me. Welcome to both of you.
Hey, thank you.
Hi, Matt.
As we often do, we've got a bit of a balance to walk today.
Yeah.
Stray too far to the left, you're in a ditch, and stray too far to the right, you're in another ditch.
Mm-hmm.
But it's, I think, worth attempting. So let me set up the topic. There seems to be a lot of offense these days, a lot of offending.
Mm-hmm.
And people have acted badly forever. So it's not actually more offense, but perhaps how we take offense. For example, trauma, bullying, emotional hurt. These types of phrases are used, and they're household terms.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, how do we use these terms, and can we use them inappropriately in interrelational context? Do you see what I'm saying? Where we leverage these things. And so that's what I want to recognize, that we can go into two ditches here, because these terms are so important.
That's correct.
If trauma is something, then let's get trauma right, because we devalue the term if we don't.
That's correct.
Do you see the narrow path?
Yeah.
I think so.
There sure is. And I think one of the things that we would say is that some words that are clinical terms, like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and trauma, they're words that weren't in everybody's vocabulary back when World War II happened. Okay, it is in the vocabulary now. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, for people that have true post-traumatic stress disorder, somebody that's had their life threatened, somebody that's been assaulted and victimized, knowing that they have PTSD is a good thing so they can get treatment. But it's interesting because we become familiar with the term and then start to spread it out, okay? So like I was at the ice cream shop and I bumped into somebody and dropped my ice cream cone. It was so traumatic. I've got PTSD every time I see that ice cream shop. Well, that's not PTSD. That's not trauma. It might have been a frustrating circumstance. You might have been embarrassed, but it doesn't qualify.
Because we have terms for these really important matters and hurts in our life, it does make us, I think, inward and very, very thoughtful, which I think is really, really healthy, right? As individuals, would we say, I mean, you mentioned post-World War II, we wouldn't have the words. And without the words, you don't have the thoughts.
That's right.
Without the thoughts, you don't have the inward inspection, right?
Sure.
And I quickly go to my grandfolks, for example.
Right.
I mean, they went through the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Isn't that trauma for everybody? You know what I mean? But they didn't have the words. And sometimes as I compare my life to hers, I'm like, am I kind of fragile? Because I am does that make sense? And sometimes I'm wondering, like, am I sturdy enough to do this life?
Right.
Grandma, what can you tell me?
And I think it speaks to the reality that the context that we live in and our current day reality has such a profound impact on us. And what is normal to us is largely dictated by what is just commonplace. And you learn how to do that because that's just the water that you're swimming in. And we live in a different context than they have in that time frame.
Yeah. For sure. I think one of the things is when you go back generations, particularly the further you go back, most of life was about how we make it through the day, how we eat, how we sleep, how we provide. And we're in a different time, particularly in the U.S. right now. We're not in a third world place where every day you're looking for your meal or something like that. But one of the things that happens is as you move from needing to survive to being able to think about aspirations. Who do I want to be? Where do I want to go? These kind of things. One of the things that happens is we've shifted a big portion of it. And it's not necessarily wrong or bad, but it's very different to be thinking about, a goal versus how are we going to make it this winter.
I think that's very astute. Bruce Shelley is an author who wrote Christian History in Plain Language. He makes this comment, just kind of an off comment, but this comment that he says, all of human history found life is just suffering. Most of all human history, life was, to your point, getting through it. Yeah. And then he talks more about their hopes and what religion played in that. But anyway, the point is, I was taken aback by that. And it's like, that's not how I process my life at all. Getting through it, it's like making the most of it is the way that I process my life. And that has impact here with this, right?
Right, yeah. Like prosperity allows you just to ask different questions. And those different questions give you different things to focus on, which is really exciting, but also then opens up a whole world of things that you've never even thought about. There's never even been space for.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point because particularly in the last 100 years, here we are in at this point in time. If you go back,
it's 2025.
Yeah.
Were you trying to search for that?
I was trying to figure out if you wanted me to date it was going to date the podcast. So I was like, oh, do I say that?
Fair enough.
Because of prosperity, which isn't in and of itself bad, because of technology, healthcare, okay, and these kind of things, it allows different expectations of life, and the pursuit of happiness, okay, is actually, that's something that people can shoot for. That doesn't mean that everything today is happy. And so what happens, we're still in a very broken world. And we see it in the news, we see it in life, and it's around us. So prosperity doesn't equal happiness. Technology doesn't equal happiness. Healthcare doesn't equal happiness. But it does raise the expectation, and culture and advertising raise the expectation that my life should be happy and it should be easy. Okay?
Ted, expectation was the exact word, as you were talking there, that came to my mind as well. And so if there is an expectation, for example, for bliss, then it's easy to call out offense, anything that is contrary, that is working against that goal of bliss. Does that make sense?
For sure.
So, which makes me a connoisseur of my suffering. If the expectation is suffering, then when it comes, it's not offensive in the same way. My point is, are we offended more today than perhaps they were in the past? We can't answer that definitively, but this mental exercise, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I think, again, I don't know if there's more offense or not, like you're saying, but certainly we're much more aware of it because we're not having to wrestle with some of the things that previous generations did. So we're kind of going back even to the context we live in. We live in a context that's really quick to say, hey, are you being treated the way you ought to be treated? A really great question, for sure. But if that's the question you're always asking, inevitably you're going to run into multiple times through your day when, no, you're not being treated the way you ought to.
Which Jesus talked about treating people as they ought to be treated, but it was always, am I treating others
exactly
the way that they should be treated?
Which is a very different question, a different focus.
Yeah. And with that, I think one of the things that we run is that we have to continually think about this balance that the Scripture provides for us. And one of the balances is that this earth and this life, this place is not our home. The other thing, that suffering, that there is something wrong with the world, okay? And suffering is real because of the fall, because of sin, because of my own sin, because of somebody else's. That's really real. But it also redeems these things, okay? Now, actually, Christ's redemption and new life says that there's purpose and meaning. And purpose and meaning is valuable to shoot for, as opposed to, hey, I'm supposed to be happy, don't bump me, okay? Don't disagree with me. If you disagree with me, then you're a hater, okay? Well, that's a very different thing than we have a different opinion, let me hear you, you hear me, and we have dialogue. We can even agree or disagree strongly, but the issue is now the fact that we disagree, what's that mean for us? Is that, we have to part ways?
Well, when disagreement in my mind equals suffering, that's where I get off on the wrong way.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
for sure.
So having a good definition of suffering, I think, is part of the human challenge.
Yes, absolutely. Whereas, I think maybe in the history, that would have been something like, oh, this is an opportunity where I can learn, and to interact with somebody that has a different thought or different idea is actually for my benefit and my good, which, puts it in a very different stage.
Yeah. So you've just given a perspective that disagreement is opportunity.
Right.
And set that next to disagreement is suffering. Two completely different trajectories.
That's right. Another thing we have to take account for is we oftentimes then hear, well, this person over here has a victim mentality. I want to separate out something about this that's really important. When somebody experiences something like an assault or somebody, took advantage of them and took their money and things like that, they are a victim. That is an accurate description of what happened, okay? What happens on the other hand, and are there people that will be on the other extreme of somebody who stays in a place where they never recover but kind of milk it, okay? I think that's the fear that people, I'm sure that happens. What's interesting is the person that's an actual victim, okay? Well, we'll see some people sometimes that are like, I'm sorry, I'm complaining. And we're going, you're not complaining. You were really wounded. This is a real deal. And they've minimized it because they're afraid that they're going to be called out somebody that has a victim mentality. And in our counseling work, we're trying to help people to go from being a victim to a survivor to somebody who's thriving. Okay, that's a model that we use. Victim, survivor to thriving or overcoming. So we want to move them that way. But to say that this isn't real is wrong. But to also, we don't want to say, okay, you've suffered, so good luck. You're just going to have to sit there. So the Christian message allows us to think about how we redeem hurts, how we grow, how we work with them, and some things about life that are really hard and not fair.
I really appreciate you bringing up that idea and delineating between a true victim and a victim mentality. And I think victim mentality is very pervasive.
Sure.
It's very real. It wouldn't be hard for me to comb through my own life to point out where I have a victim mentality, where I can leverage hurts, for example. Maybe I would just not want to see resolve because the leverage is too great, right?
Yeah.
That's insidious like that.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, and maybe an example of this would be even this would have been a couple of years ago. I go through a training, a secular training for counseling. And at the end, the question is whether or not do you think your beliefs, your ideas, your perspective, your worldview was respected throughout this training? Well, no. But that's an impossible thing for them to be able to do. They're not coming at it from the same worldview that I am. So I can't expect them to be able to honor every belief system within that room. But I know that, and therefore for me to say, well, no, I don't think it was. But as a conservative Christian, I don't come in here expecting that. I've got to figure out what to take that I think is wise and beneficial and what to set aside, which again is just a very different mindset. Or even to think about my son when he's at school and somebody makes fun of his haircut. Like, well, sure, you could call that bullying. You could call that he's a victim, or you can say, okay, hey, bud, that's unfortunate. That shouldn't happen. We want to acknowledge that, and we want to figure out how to walk through that, and not to see that as the same as the kid who really gets beat up in the parking lot or recess or those sorts of things.
One of the things that's come to me as you give those examples, Brian, is this belief that the world should orient itself according to me.
Yeah.
And so that was really the question. Did we orient this according to you? Did we orient it according to you? Well, at the end of the day, no, and you couldn't.
Yeah. Right.
But in all of our interactions, when we have a mentality that life needs to orient itself to me, we're off on the wrong foot.
Yeah, I think the concept also occurs around the term persecution. Persecution is real, and believers feel it in a wide variety of ways and spaces. But it's interesting because when you take what I've experienced as a Christian in a secular society in a field that doesn't, I've experienced some bumps, some slights, some unkind things at times. Okay, my point is, we got to be careful to go into a mindset that, oh, I'm bearing the worst cross ever. It was frustrating. It was hard. I had to work through it and navigate it, and I did. It's his own story. But let's be careful because, I haven't resisted to the point of blood, as it says.
Well, Ted, and this is what I heard from what you said there, which I think is a very poignant observation and easy for all of us. And that is to have a respect for the human experience, the broad human experience, to have that perspective, as you mentioned, persecution, and you divided in this a very, very continuum. Maybe this, but it's certainly not that, required you to have an understanding of the broader Christian human experience. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I think that is really helpful to this conversation, because when we get myopic and we lose sight of the broader human experience, that gets us into some...
Yeah, and I think with that, one of the things that comes to mind there is that even for, Ted's example there, it's important that you can register as that was hurtful. That was hard. And if we can do that, but then do that in, relationship, then that can help us kind of say, okay, where am I at? And help us process. Whereas a lot of times, even that we deal with in the counseling offices, we isolate and we kind of try to sort through that on our own. And then a lot of times that either leads to, this shouldn't bother me at all, or it lends to kind of making it much bigger than what it was. And those are the sorts of things that we get into those ditches that aren't helpful.
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens with that isolation piece is if we don't have somebody to bounce it off of or don't have a frame of reference, things get really kind of either or. Okay, either I was persecuted this bad, which is at 100, or it wasn't at all. It was a 0, or it was a 1. There's an entire continuum here, and you got to remember too, whatever we're in at the time, that's big to us. You ask a 6th grader what they want you to pray about, they'll say, I've got a big math test tomorrow, and it'll be the easiest thing, but it's big to them. So I think that's the other piece here, that we just have to be able to meet people where they're at, to understand. And the other thing is people have different tolerances. My wife and I were in the airport, going through TSA and different things.
That's traumatic.
And
Ted, go ahead and share about that.
And let me tell you what, I think I did. I think at lunch yesterday I did use the word traumatic, but I used it in that broad sense. The thing about it was, I was anxious, and the guy was, do this, whatever this, and I was just discombobulated, and I felt really, and then it was like, come on, that happens. That's what happens when you come through and through TSA, and you got to calm down. She was like,
she had an expectation that you didn't have.
She did. She's like, yeah, everybody's grumpy in TSA, so just don't worry about it. Just walk through and go on.
I started by saying we've got a narrow path to walk, and we got ditches on either side. A ditch that we can fall into is to minimize. And what I hear you're saying, Ted, is don't minimize the hurt. Acknowledge the hurt for what it is. So it's
a tricky landscape.
Yes, it is a tricky landscape.
Yeah, but I think that's the thing, where if we can find that place of being able to acknowledge hard, and particularly when somebody has been victimized and they've been in a place where there's been authority or significant harm or the potential for harm, like those are huge things, and we want to honor that, and even the smaller things to recognize it's still hard and it's painful, but we can be invited to come alongside of that, and it's not really our job to necessarily figure out exactly where they fall on that spectrum, or ourselves, as much as like, okay, what is it? What am I walking through, and how do I walk through this wisely, and that's more difficult than what it seems like it should be sometimes.
In a progressive, healthy manner,
Right.
Yeah.
I think is part of when you, going back to Ted, you're talking about the victim and the victim mentality. A victim mentality probably doesn't want to see improvement as much as maybe holding on to that.
Yeah.
Would that be a good way to understand it?
Yeah, and I think one of the things is that there's labels that get put on a lot of different things, and sometimes the labels are helpful and sometimes unhelpful, and so we just have to, and that's why having people to help us walk through, help us to find right things, and parents help kids and spouses and people in church. We help each other, and so it's like that. Let's say an authority figure. Okay, somebody was wounded by an authority figure. The tendency emotionally is to say, an authority figure wounded me here. It can be really easy to then go to the next authority figure and say, this person's a wounder also, or they're suspect because or a person in this role, a policeman is this way, a TSA agent is this way. Again, I'm going to tell you that the TSA agents were grumpy in O'Hare Airport last week. Okay, and also in Denver.
And that TSA agent is going to say, you know what, there was a real knucklehead.
Yeah, that's
he
right.
just did not know what to do.
Brian, what is the common denominator between Denver Airport and O'Hare Airport?
Boy, this is tough.
And I know Donna is one, but that's not the one I'm talking about.
Yeah, okay. So the common denominator was me. But you guys have thrown me into the bus. I'm not even sure my point at this point, but I do think that I have to defend myself.
But I don't know if this follows. But one of the things I was thinking about earlier in reference to the victim mentality is that very rarely does anybody even realize they're doing that.
Yeah.
And so it's not necessarily a conscious thing. But there are a lot of people who fear being that.
Oh, yeah.
And then they double down on the other side of just like, nope, nothing's gonna affect me. And it's more about like being fearful that that's what they'll become rather than, no, you acknowledging that this.
I think that's really helpful. Here I got two clinicians sitting here, and you spend a fair amount of your time helping people see that their hurt matters.
Right.
And they have undermined it themselves. Is that what I'm hearing?
Some people do
right?
that.
Some
Yes,
people do that.
That's for sure. There's a group of people for whom, they'll come in, why am I depressed? I just don't know why I'm depressed, and what's wrong with me.
And then you learn their story.
And then I'm like, and then they're telling me the story, and I'm like, okay. I'm like, any one of those things, you're telling me 5 things, and any one of those things could have put somebody in that category. So we do that. There are other people that will be more expansive about things and feel things really acutely and those kind of things. We have to help them see things in context and things like that. And again, we're both sides of this need to be listened to be encouraged, helped, walked with.
Yeah, maybe one comment from each of you as we think about living in this world full of offenses. What is required to live in this world where offenses abound?
Well, I think there are many things that are required. That's the tricky part. There's so many. I think certainly a couple that come to mind would be wisdom. Wisdom to know when there's been offense and what kind of an offense that's been. Where do you take that offense? How do you process that internally? I think wisdom would be one thing. I think another thing would just be grace and forgiveness, to be able to, what does that look like to, as we've experienced offense, wherever they fall on the spectrum, to see that as we follow Christ, that's part of what he calls us into. And sometimes that's going to be very challenging to be able to extend forgiveness or grace. And I think even what that motivates me to think about is being quick to try to think about what that looks like in the small offenses, because that's hard enough. And if I'm not practicing and learning and being able to build that out on those small things, then to think I'm going to be able to do that when that trauma does hit or that big offense hits.
And Brian, if I were to, my word picture for what you just said is flexibility as opposed to rigidity. And I try that on. I can see that.
Yeah.
Where I break pretty easy. I need to be more flexible and absorb some of that. And I think grace and forgiveness and wisdom go into that. Ted, one or two things?
Yeah, I think one of the things isn't in our expectations of life, we really have to work on separating out the difference between finding our sense of joy and happiness in circumstances versus in God and His promises and the direction we're going. And I think it's easy to say, and I can say it as a preacher. I've said it as a preacher, and I know that sometimes it's hard for me to follow in it. But we have to remember that this world has many joys, but it isn't heaven. It isn't heaven. It isn't going to be heaven. Relationships are wonderful and messy. You know, the world that we live in is beautiful and broken. And we have to be able to see that it's both of those things and to not live into the dimness that happens if you say it's all broken, there's no good anywhere, or believe that everything's supposed to be in a Pollyanna world.
Yeah.
Those two, living in either of those places either leads you to constant frustration about the brokenness of life or despair over the brokenness of life. And God doesn't need either of those.
That's great. Ryan, you helped us, gave us a lens for viewing our hurt. And Ted, you gave us a lens to looking up and out of our hurt. And I think both of those are probably great takeaways. Thanks, each of you, for tackling this. Did we walk the road?
I'm not sure Brian did.
I'm not sure.
We'll find out.
We'll find out in the edit,
everyone.
man.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. God bless you. And we have a tremendous amount of respect for the hurt and the offense that everybody has incurred, as small as it might be, as great as it might be. And we just, we all want to live healthily with the hurts that we all have. We're not going to get out of this life without it, I don't think. Goodbye.